I volunteered because I believed in a prevailing national mythos that what we were being told is true and real and is the state of our world was in fact a witting and continuing lie by some of the highest representatives in our government. The NSA was collecting the phone records of every Verizon customer on a daily basis. We talk about awards for progress in civil liberties. We talk about the importance of independent thought and the history of it. And this is really what it is. You know, I did sign up to work for the government. I volunteered for the Army. I applied to the CIA. I worked as a contractor in NSA facilities on NSA computers. Again and again and again. People think contractors like you're working in a different building, but no, you're in. It's just a continuation of government service. I did when everyone else was protesting. I was a younger man, and I was much less politically educated, I'd like to think, than I am today. You know, some things only come with experience. But so yeah, it raises this question of how does someone like who I was become someone like who I am. And I got to tell you, it was hard. It wasn't easy. It wasn't natural. It wasn't something I ever expected to do.
He believed in transparency. He believed in noble missions. Soon, he noticed gaps between ideals and reality. Propaganda about wars promised clarity.
But like I said, I signed up to all of these things. I volunteered because I believed in a prevailing national mythos to which we are all subscribed.
We now have confirmation that our phones are actually listening to us at all times.
And in every case that I'm aware of, these companies have eventually turned over the recordings.
And this researcher has proven that our phones are even uploading data about us even when our phones are off.
Everything you do on an unsecured network is at risk. Your passwords, credit card info, and even sensitive work documents could be exposed to prying eyes. Now more than ever, is it important to protect your data online. Think about public Wi-Fi. You're at a cafe, or in an airport, or even at the gym, and you're connecting to free Wi-Fi without a second thought. That free Wi-Fi is often a hacker's playground. With just a few clicks, someone can intercept your connection, steal your information, and even track your browsing habits. That's where Private Internet Access, or PIA, comes in. With Private Internet Access, you can safeguard all your online activities with military-grade encryption, protecting you from hackers, governments, and even your internet provider. Plus, they have a strict no-logs policy, which means they don't track or store any of your browsing history, so your privacy stays private. One click and you're protected. No complicated setup required. That's why we use Private Internet Access. Get 83% off and 4 months free using our link for a limited time. You can click the link in the description to try it out today.
When we're born into our country, when we go to a school system where we're basically the only one in the world, where you get up in the morning and you pledge allegiance to a flag. We all have the same stories. We all watch the same channels. You know, we see men like you on TV kind of telling us what's happening in the world and what it's like. And what changed me was a realization that as someone who held a top secret clearance and had access far beyond what a top secret clearance would entitle someone to generally, private truths of what was actually happening in our government, what our government actually does, what our nation was involved in without the knowledge or consent of the people that it purports to represent, was very different than the public representation of it.
Humanity, in his view, is not just about the self. It is about connection, friendship, family, community.
And that, really, just that seed alone was the start of a journey that would take me many years to ultimately realize, and the decision, as you said, to come forward. And the ultimate reason why I came forward was simply to bridge that gap in my own experience and share that with everyone else, to share the realization that I came to, that what we were being told is true and real and is the state of our world, was in fact a witting and continuing lie by some of the highest representatives in our government. And I felt that people needed to know that.
Real living means caring for others as much as for oneself.
The NSA was collecting the phone records of every Verizon customer on a daily basis. They were doing this for other major telecommunications providers as well. I just didn't have the judicial order for that. And this was happening to the internet. This was happening to email communications. What was happening was a change in technology from the old internet that was sort of non-commercial, very individual and simple. It was pretty crude. Everything was cobbled together, to this larger, more corporatized internet where all of our communications, all of our interactions, all of our relationships, all of the things that we read and like online are being passed to us through a Facebook or a Google or an Apple. And in secret, these companies had basically gone far beyond what the law required of government to join programs where they would share information with the NSA through the front door of the FBI.
Each clearance opened another curtain. With every step, his conscience felt heavier.
And it was continuing for years without the kind of individual warrants and legal process that we expected and we had become accustomed to. That we're told in the Constitution, this is how our government works. And so for me, when you ask what was the lie, the lie was not any one particular part of these programs. It wasn't a particular detail. It was the fact that there was a breathtaking sweep of intentional, knowing public deception by people at the level of the Senate, by people in these different executive agencies, intelligence agencies, and then in the White House itself, even from the president, then President Barack Obama, who campaigned on ending warrantless wiretapping that he had criticized so heavily in the Bush administration, but had in fact, in secret, extended and embraced these programs and these authorities to a level that I began to feel had truly narrowed the boundaries of our rights.
At first, his doubts were small, almost private, but as he advanced into technical roles, they grew louder. Each promotion gave him access to more classified material, and with it, a closer view of how information was managed.
Well, so this was the thing. When you look at the arc of my career in intelligence, I was always working on the technical aspect of it. And so, by and large, I was modernizing our systems because post 9/11, the intelligence community realized they weren't very good at using technology. They thought they were. And in a way, it was true that they were, but it was a different era's technology. They were great with radio. They were great with satellite. They weren't so good with computers. They weren't so good with the internet. So they brought in a bunch of shaggy young guys who looked like me. But it wasn't that I was, exceptional, so much that I represented a generation that was native to these new systems that they had shied away from because they didn't trust the security of them. It turned out with good reason. But my generation came in, we shared our experiences, we shared our specialties, and we were always looking at what we were doing through a straw.
He saw how intelligence was filtered. He saw how words were crafted. He saw how truths were bent into stories that could be sold.
Normally, you get a project, you do a project. You don't know where it goes, you don't know who else is using it. But bit by bit, I was redirecting and collecting the flow of intelligence. Then I was backing it up, permanizing it, making it so that if we lost a building, if we lost a site, we didn't lose everything that had passed through that, the information that had been passed through that. And I thought this was information about terrorists. I thought this was saving lives. I thought this was preventing wars. But as I moved higher and higher in the organization, as I moved from CIA to NSA, as I moved from office to office, my straw that I'm looking through gets wider and wider and wider until I land in this place called the Office of Information Sharing. It turned out I would be much better at this job than anyone expected. And I saw everything.
Television spoke in patriotic certainty. Inside classified briefings, the tone was manipulation. What looked like security began to look like control.
I talked to my supervisors, I talked to my colleagues on Constitution Day. It's not quite that people had no problems. When I brought up these programs that many of them had never heard of because they hadn't been exposed to them, I said, does this look right to you? When I show that we're collecting more internet communications in the United States at the NSA than we were in Russia. And it's only there when you see the consequences of your labor and the different parts of your career all brought together with the labor of others of your entire generation who themselves, not sitting in the position you are, can't see the big picture impact of what they're doing. And the public, who never even knew this stuff existed, and again, this was occurring without their consent, but in theory, it was being carried out in their name. It felt to me that we needed to know. We needed to actually decide, is this what we want to happen or not?
His realization did not come in one flash. It built slowly. Each job revealed another layer.
I wasn't setting out to change policy. I was setting out to restore the balance between the governing and the governed, which has started to get a little bit out of whack. I mean, as you say, we elect representatives for a reason, right? But the only way that we can understand whether we want to re-elect them or support their policies, continue this, is if we actually know what they are, in at least broad outlines. Now, I'm not saying we need to know the name of every terrorist target. I'm not saying we need to know the name of every company we penetrated or whatever. But if we don't know at least those broad outlines, we're starting to enter a system where actually our votes begin to become ineffective. Because as you say, we elect people to represent us. But if we don't know what they're doing, and if we don't know what the other candidates who are their alternatives would be doing, what are our votes really doing? So I think necessarily there is a bias toward an informed public rather than one that's in the dark. Now, there are exceptions to this. But these exceptions are, I would argue, extraordinarily rare. When we're in times of total war, for example, U-boats in the harbor, we're already engaging in policies. We've rolled back civil liberties in ways that we would never approve of during peacetime. And we very likely should not in peacetime, thinking about things like Japanese internment. But regardless of our desires, in fact, we see the human nature they often do. These things become more clear because we're starting to talk about existential threats to the nation. Now, there are no serious officials, including the President of the United States, does not consider terrorism to be an existential threat to the United States. I think that's fair. But when we think about how this balance is done, and I think you're starting to get onto a theme, which is that, are we throwing open the doors if we allow whistleblowing to occur without punishment? If we allow people who are at the working level to reveal evidence of serious wrongdoing or policy failures, waste, fraud, and abuse, however you want to classify it, is this something that will very rapidly get out of control? Will there be sort of an anarchic rise of all of these low-level employees whenever a policy decision is made, saying, I don't agree with that, I don't agree with that, I'm running to the newspaper, and things will fall apart? Well, I would argue the record shows that's not likely. Because let's look at the case in the status quo today. Are there any cases of successful whistleblowers who have changed policy in the national security space, right, in this classified space we're discussing, who have not been retaliated against severely? Daniel Ellsberg was literally charged with treason for his activities back on the Pentagon Papers in the 70s. And this was, again, referring to a huge report. I believe it was thousands of pages, but something that was he was revealing after it happened. The information was a little bit stale. Despite this, treason, it was during a time of war. Technically, his life was on the line. The only reason he was not actually convicted was because of the government's wrongdoing. I think you wrote a book on the Espionage Act, and pointed out that there's often no defense at all against these charges. We've seen Thomas Drake, again, who was trying to reveal the Bush-era warrantless wiretapping program, which I believe you've spoken out against. And yet he was subject to criminal investigation. His career was over. He lost his wife. He lost his home. Now, rather than working as a senior executive at the National Security Agency, where he's drawing an SES level pay grade, for those of you who aren't in the government, the senior executives have an entirely different pay grade, which is, shall we say, very well accommodating. And now he works at an Apple store selling iPods. I would argue that there is enough natural countervailing weight against whistleblowing. There are enough counter arguments there that we don't need to worry about that so much. Now, if I could just make one point here, because I think it is important for sort of the timeline of how people understand this. And this was not public until quite recently. Laura Poitras, the first journalist which I was in contact with, was at that point communicating with an anonymous source who said, look, there are serious things going on in terms of mass surveillance. But she wrote in her journal that the source was unwilling to actually provide classified information to her at this point. He was willing to hint, he was willing to talk about the programs, but he wasn't actually willing to provide documentation. 10 days after that session in Congress, she said the source, which was me, had said they were ready to provide documentation. That, for me, was the Rubicon moment. But I hadn't gotten to the point of, should I light my own life on fire? Because I knew the risks. We had seen other whistleblowers previously. Thomas Drake, now we see recently Thomas Tam, Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, Ed Loomis, many other whistleblowers who had had their careers destroyed for going through the established process. But it eventually reached a point where public officials were having conflicts within Congress. I wasn't new to the intelligence community. I'd been working in it for 8 years before I came public. Actually, I believe more than 8 years. And the thing here is that over time, particularly in the Obama administration, we were given the impression in the press that things were changing, that programs were shutting down. Again, the president promised to shut down Guantanamo, a thing which, again, he should be applauded for, but he didn't actually do it. Now, that's not something we can assign entirely to him, because obviously there's Congress involved and other things like that. But particularly in the progress of the laws, the progress of the policies, the progress of the technologies that I worked with directly, and in fact, helped build and design some of these systems, a point which, perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss later in the evening. But for me, it really came to a head. I had thought prior to this that there was something that must be done. I wanted to remove from myself the authority, the sort of positional capability to publish any document on my own. And that's the reason why now we're sitting in 2016. I've never made public a single classified document. Now, what I did do is try to replicate that same system of checks and balances, which had failed in our government. Again, clearly, Senator Ron Wyden felt that he should have made, or that this program should have been public when he was questioning the Director of National Intelligence about, does this program exist, basically. We had seen earlier in that year, in February of 2013, the courts had an opportunity to assess the same thing and actually validate the constitutionality of laws, validate, sort of do an independent assessment of the propriety of these mass surveillance programs in a court case called Amnesty versus Clapper, which was brought forward by the ACLU. But they demurred. They said the executive branch was asserting state secrets, right? And courts, by long tradition, tend to defer to the executive when they go, look, it's a secret, don't get involved. And beyond that, they went, the plaintiffs couldn't prove that they had been spied on, which of course raises the question of, would the court have decided differently if the plaintiffs actually could prove, yes, in fact, we had been spied on. And the president and sort of the executive branch in general, of course, could have rolled back these programs, but they didn't. In fact, they were clearly trying to shelter themselves in many different ways, where they didn't have to take any sort of stance where they would publicly explain what is the value of these programs, what is the efficacy of these programs, and what is truly the necessity of these programs. And this, I think, clearly goes to the heart of the issue, which is that 2013 isn't wholly about surveillance. Now, surveillance is obviously a critical factor of it. That's much of what we've discussed. But what we're talking about here now isn't really about surveillance at all. It's about democracy, right? And democracies, right, our governments, open, liberal, Western democracies, tend to derive their legitimacy, their ability to pass laws, to rule, to enforce policies, on the principle of the consent of the governed. But as anyone in this room could tell you, consent is only meaningful if it is informed. So then how do we bridge that gap where the system does fail? And as you say, we suddenly have a case. The system has failed comprehensively. The only people who can actually write this system are individuals. But these individuals aren't all at the top level, right? There are, of course, senior directives and executives who could have done the same thing, but there are also people at the working level who can do the same thing. Is your seniority really more critical than what you've witnessed, right? There are many people at the top level of these programs who know how the policies work. They know every letter of the law, but they have never actually run a query through a system of mass surveillance in their life. They know the theory of how it's implemented, but they don't know the fact of how it is executed. And so for me, I recognize that I wasn't perfectly placed, as you imply, actually, as you stated, and no offense taken by it. I was not sitting, next to the table of the Secretary of Defense having this conversation with him. But this is why we have a free press. This is why the First Amendment is first, right? We need to have a truly independent, apolitical faction within free society that can challenge the government for control over information on which they will base their votes. And so I talked to the journalists and I said, look, I'm going to make an independent assessment of the documents that are available to me on the basis of the things that are known to me of what you need to know to make that independent judgment about the lawfulness, the efficacy, the propriety of these programs. I do not want you to publish all of these documents. In fact, I don't want you to publish any detail, any fact that you do not believe to be necessary and serve a vital role in the public interest for us to know about. And then further, beyond this, beyond my review, beyond the journalist's review, I required them to agree that they would go to the government in advance of publishing every story and give the government sort of almost an opportunity to do a sort of a negotiated injunction here, where the government would have the opportunity to review the documents on which they're based. If you gain access to classified information, you're required by this policy to safeguard it, and of course by some federal laws. However, it's a civil agreement, literally just a standard bureaucratic form like all of the others you fill out when you're being brought onboarded to these agencies. There are many of them, called SF-312. It's literally a standard form that the government makes everyone sign, and make an independent assessment of would these cause specific harm to any policy, any program, or critically, most critically, any individual. And in all cases, that process has been followed to the best of my knowledge, and the government does not dispute that. The only thing that is in contention is that the journalists, and these aren't just sort of radical journalists, we're not talking leftists or anything, we're talking about the Washington Post, the New York Times, said that in no case of the stories they published that they believe they put a life at risk. And that's why I think now we're in 2016, right? Not 2013, when it was quite reasonable to go, this could cost lives. This seems really dangerous. And in fact, it could have been. Now, I don't discount the fact that risks were involved in this, but the operation of a free press necessarily involves risk. Living in a free society involves risk. That is not a weakness, that is a strength.